Hello? Nina, 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 Nina.
18-month-old Devinder and his baby brother Ravinder were the sons of successful businessman Neil Chohan.
Hello.
With a loving marriage to his wife Nancy, Neil had everything a man could want. But in February 2003, just 2 days after this film was shot, all 5 members of this happy family simply disappeared.
Vanished without a trace.
3 generations of one family.
Chohan's are now at the centre of a major police hunt.
Why would anybody want to simply walk away and leave it all behind?
This is the story of a man who made an entire family disappear.
Detectives later found evidence of the macabre journey.
2 members of an underworld.
The story of an extraordinary deception by a ruthless criminal who wanted to get rich at any cost.
He had absolutely no moral conscience whatsoever.
A man who almost succeeded in outwitting the police by committing a crime so unique and horrific, no one dared to believe it had taken place.
The prosecution had described the crimes as beyond belief.
In 2003, businessman Neil Chohan was the owner of a successful fruit importation firm based at Heathrow called Seba Freight. With a wife and 2 children, Chohan was known to his staff as a contented family man and an easygoing boss.
Neil's way of running the company was a relaxed, sort of like happy-go-lucky attitude. We all mucked in. Whenever it was busy, he'd get pizzas, get drinks. Everyone was sort of like one big happy family.
But owning a freight company had made Neil Chohan a target. In January 2003, a recently released convict arrived at Seba Freight looking for work. His name was Kenneth Regan.
You must be Ken.
That's me. You're Mr. Chohan, right?
Neil Chohan had spent time in prison for tax evasion and was sympathetic to the ex-con who said he wanted to go straight.
Neil was a very fair person. He'd always give people not a second chance, but a 10th chance. He'd been in prison himself, and obviously he'd had a second chance, so why shouldn't anybody else? Ken came on as a driver. Not frightened of getting his hands dirty, and as a worker, I thought he was good.
But Kenneth Regan was no ordinary delivery driver. Five years earlier, Regan had been a successful drug smuggler, known to his friends as Captain Cash.
In the late 90s, Ken Regan was a career criminal. Regan set up freight companies in and around the Heathrow area, and he'd use those as a front to bring drugs into the country. He knew most of the major criminals in London and criminal families, and he was very much living the high life.
It was in a fashionable London bar that Regan first met celebrity agent and socialite Belinda Bruin.
He was a bit rough, I think. Not well educated, quite charming, dressed well, nice watch, spent a lot of money. He was kind of like a rich, wide boy. Regan's nickname was Captain Cash. He always had a lot of money, and I mean high denomination notes. He had a briefcase, and I've seen that twice, and it was just full of money. And I think he thought it brought him class when he had none whatsoever.
Belinda would eventually be drawn unwittingly into Regan's world of crime and deceit. It started when the gangster became obsessed with her.
He used to phone me quite a lot and emails saying, I haven't felt like this in 30 years. You're like a drug. I can't. I mean, just bizarre, considering that he didn't really know me at all. And then one day, a friend of mine said to me, why on earth are you going out with someone like Regan? And I said to him, I'm not. And he said, well, he told me that you're his girlfriend. And I said, you've got to be kidding. And he said, no, I'm not, which I found slightly worrying. And then literally, I think a few days later, he got arrested.
June the 17th, 1998, Regan was caught with 25 kilograms of heroin. Facing 18 years in prison, he decided to become a grass. Regan's testimony helped convict 12 major criminals, while his own sentence was reduced. By the time he was released from prison 4 years later, Captain Cash had few friends and little money.
When Regan was released from his prison sentence, he'd very much gone back to having nothing. All his assets had been stripped from him as part of the confiscation order. And here he was, back living in one bedroom of a very small bungalow with his father. Regan, I think, very much wanted to get back in the driving seat as a drug importer. Mr. Chohan's business was the perfect framework to hang his drug-dealing activities on.
Regan came up with a plan to steal Neil Chohan's company. A plan so ruthless that no one would realize it had taken place. He began by setting a trap. Soon after starting work at SIBA, Regan approached Chohan and said he knew some investors who wanted to buy the company. The bait was a cash offer of £3 million, a large enough sum to tempt the businessman whose wife Nancy wanted him to retire.
I've got investors.
I knew that Nancy wanted to go back to India. She'd made it clear she missed India. And we talked about it a couple of times because he did say that the level of education in India was higher than the UK, and Nancy was desperate to go back there.
While Chohan considered his offer, Regan began working on the next phase of his plan. SIBA Freight was not the only thing he wanted to acquire. By this time, Belinda Bruin had given up her house in Chelsea for a new life in Devon. Regan's obsessive calls and letters had stopped during his 4 years in prison, but now free, he began to pursue Belinda once more.
A few weeks after he got out of prison, he left me a few messages on my mobile. He said that he had a business deal he wished to discuss with me. And at the time, I had this huge house, a huge mortgage, and 2 kids at private school when I'd given up my job and then my boyfriend left me. So it was, how can I put it? Yes, so I rang him.
Regan told Belinda he was planning to take over SIBA Freight and needed a new managing director. Although she had no relevant experience, Regan offered her a huge salary for a 2-day week.
At first, he offered me £54,000, which is a lot of money. But I thought, you know, I've got 2 kids at private school and a huge mortgage. That's not going to cover everything. And so he said, fine, I'll pay you £72,000. And I thought, well, that's great.
The job offer gave Regan an excuse to visit Belinda at her isolated Devon home.
He'd come up with bizarre reasons, like he'd want me to sign a letter or a form, or he'd want me to help him fill in a form, and he'd drive all the way from Salisbury or from London to my house for 20 minutes.
Regan seemed to become strangely fixated on the land around Belinda's farm.
He used to moan about the mud a lot. The mud in the lane, you know, I couldn't live here, it's so disgusting. He wanted to cut down some of the trees and build a nice wall and electric gates. I mean, this was an old farmhouse, not a footballer's pad in Essex. He kept saying, I could make this place really, really nice for you. What you need is a drainage ditch.
By February, Chohan had made up his mind. He would meet the investors that Regan said wanted to buy his company. On the Thursday morning before Valentine's Day, he left his office telling staff he had a meeting at Stonehenge.
He said, I'm going off to do a deal. and sell the company. He said, and I'll let you know. And that was the last time I saw him.
On Monday morning, the employees at SIBA were greeted with a shock announcement.
I came in on a shift on Monday. We all gathered around and Belinda was introduced as the new owner of the company by Ken. It came as a shock to everyone. It was something we weren't expecting, you know?
Everyone was thinking what had happened to Anil, where he had gone. Is it real that he sold the company, or what about our jobs? And so many things happening at the same time.
Regan produced a letter which explained that Chohan had sold the company and was retiring abroad with Nancy due to ill health. It bore the signature of Anil Chohan.
Well, because of it being a busy company, you couldn't sort of sit down and start whinging about it or do anything about it. You just had to go and get on with the work because it was a busy company. You would have to get on with the work and get the work done.
Belinda was given a desk and a computer and began examining the books as Regan had asked her to. But on her second day, she felt ill. Instead of going to SIBA, where Regan was expecting her, she drove home to Devon.
When I pulled into the drive, I couldn't believe it. There was this old beaten up junkyard, and I thought, what on earth is going on here? And I saw these two guys in my field with a digger.
The two men were William Halsey and Peter Rees, both friends of Ken Regan.
I went absolutely mad. And I swore a lot. And I said, you know, what on earth did they think they were doing? And he said, well, we're building you a drainage ditch. You know, there's this bloody great big ditch in the middle of my field running along the side of the hedge. I just couldn't believe it. Regan arrived. I said, you know, it's not the fact that I might not need a drainage ditch. It was my land. You never asked my permission. You just don't go digging up people's land. He said, well, I thought you would appreciate it. I mean, it just looked like a car park, you know, I just hated it. But I was going to have it taken up. And they said, wait till the summer. But as it happened, the Metropolitan Police dug it up for me.
In 2003, convicted drug smuggler Kenneth Regan was on the verge of regaining his former millionaire's lifestyle. Anil Chohan, the previous owner of SIBA Freight, had disappeared. Now Regan was in control of his bonded warehouse, an ideal front for importing drugs. For 5 years, Regan had been obsessed by socialite Belinda Bruin from afar, but now she was on his payroll. It seemed as if Regan's dreams had all come true, but the secret behind his success was about to be exposed. 12,000 miles away, Onka Verma was working as a journalist in New Zealand. His sister Nancy was raising a family in England with her husband Anil Chohan, and Onka was planning to visit the family for the very first time.
I was very excited because I was going to see Nancy after 9 years, and it was like a family reunion after a long time.
Onka used to speak to his sister and mother almost every day, but on the 15th of February, the phone calls simply stopped.
When I was trying to get hold of Nancy, I was trying to get hold of Mom, Anil, nobody was there. So, you know, I thought something's not right.
Concerned for his family's safety, Onka contacted the Metropolitan Police. A routine missing persons inquiry established that the family home was empty, but neighbours and colleagues seemed to think the Chohans had all gone to India.
You have to remember that if people wish to leave a country and relocate to somewhere else, then it's their right to do so. In this particular inquiry, the friends and family in the UK were very much of a belief that Mr. Chohan had decided to do that.
Onker decided that if the police couldn't find his family, he would fly to Britain to investigate the disappearances himself. Alone in a country he'd never been to before, Onker went to the family home in Hounslow and was shocked by what he discovered.
As I entered the house, I could see the kids' toys on the floor, the baby feed bottles, all the baby feed and the clothes, they were still in the house. I opened the fridge, there was uncooked food inside.
Onker became even more suspicious when he discovered his mother's most treasured possession.
My mom's prayer book was there inside the house. That was something strange because my mom used to carry it with her all the time. One thing I couldn't figure out, that how would a family disappear? We're talking about 3 adults and 2 kids, 2 babies. And how can they just disappear without telling me?
With compelling evidence that his family had left the house against their will, Onker went to the police and convinced them to launch a full investigation. DCI Andy Rowell began his inquiry by interviewing the last person who was known to have seen Chohan on the day he disappeared. Kenneth Regan.
Mr. Regan told us that Mr. Chohan was trying to sell his business, and he was very much trying to steer it down the lines of that Mr. Chohan was an unsavoury businessman who had got himself into deep water financially and that had no other choice really but to disappear.
But detectives were unconvinced by Regan's story. Using new forensic technology, they were able to track the movements of both Regan and Chohan's mobile phones on the day of the disappearance.
Initially we could see Mr. Chohan's telephone was in the Hounslow area. We then tracked the phone down to the Stonehenge area. Now, of course, Mr. Regan lived not far from Stonehenge in a village called Wilton in Salisbury. And what we could see is that Regan's telephone met up with Mr. Chohan's telephone. And then the 2 telephones travelled from that meeting point further down into the West Country towards Exeter.
The only lead the detectives had in Devon was that it was home to the new managing director of SEBA, Belinda Bruin. They decided to pay her a visit.
When Regan found out that the police were coming to my house, he was furious. And he said to me, you mustn't allow the police to come to your house. They'll just cause you aggravation. Once they get a foot in your house, you mustn't let them come to your house. I want you to phone them back and go and meet them somewhere else. And I thought, well, why would I want to do that?
Later that day, DCI Andy Rowell received a phone call from Regan's associate.
I've got some information about Anil Chohan.
William Halsey claimed he'd recently spoken to Anil Chohan and that the missing businessman was still in the UK.
I don't know, but he told me he's on the run.
Mr. Halsey had told me that he was going to meet with Mr. Chohan in Newport in Wales by the passport office to supply him with stolen passports. So what he was saying to us is that he was happy to deliver Mr. Chohan into our hands.
And then what happened was I got a phone call from D.I. Rowell saying, listen, thank you very much, Belinda, but we won't be coming to see you today. We have other information, and in fact, we probably won't need to come and see you at all. Regan then rang me up, obviously to check, to make sure that the police had cancelled their meeting, and he seemed to know that they had, and I said, yes, they're not coming. He said, yes, I know, they're going to go to Wales and arrest Anil Chohan. So that was the end of that.
The meeting with Chohan was due to take place on Easter Monday. But over the weekend, Belinda received an unexpected visit from Regan, Halsey and Rees.
Regan said, I'm going to do the lane by your stables, which actually did need gravelling, and that would have been a great place for the gravel. So I thought, well, OK. So when a digger arrived, I wasn't... It didn't surprise me, because I thought, oh, they're going to come and grade the lane. And it was a Saturday, and I took the kids into town, and I let them get on with it.
Two days later, detectives travelled to the spot where Hornsey said he was planning to meet Chohan.
In Newport, where the passport office is, there's quite an iconic bronze statue of a pig. And that's where Hornsey said that he would bring Mr. Chohan to notice. On the day in question, he in fact turned up with Mr. Regan as well, and the pair of them stood there for some moments. They then enacted receiving a phone call and a text, and then made it plainly obvious through their body language that something had gone wrong with the arrangement. And they explained they'd received a phone call from someone saying, "We know you've told the police, we're friends of Neil's or Anil Chohan's, the deal's off."
Police traced the calls, but only to an unregistered phone. They were no closer to finding Neil Chohan, and all they knew for certain was that they had been led on a wild goose chase.
I don't think personally he was having a swipe at the police and the sort of the subtle joke about pigs. I hope not, anyway.
While Regan returned to work at SEBA, the police reverted to their original plan and called in Belinda Bruin for questioning.
D.I. Rowell said to me, I want to have a full and frank discussion with you. And as I was leaving, Regan said to me, listen, Belinda, if the police ask you what I was doing on your land, he said, just tell them that I was helping you with your water system. I thought that was very odd. I mean, he'd said he'd look at it, but no work had been done on it. And I just thought it was odd. When I went to meet the police, they said to me, what do you think's happened? And I said, well, I don't really know. I said, I've told you everything that I know. And he said, is there anything else that you think is odd? And I said, well, when I was leaving today, Regan asked me it said that if you were to ask what he was doing on my land, I was to say that he'd been working on my water system. And they said, well, what was he doing? And I said, he dug a drainage ditch. And the two of them looked at each other and said, he did what?
Detectives rushed to Tiverton, convinced that a gruesome discovery awaited them on Belinda's farm.
We exhumed the dig site, painstaking fingertip forensic examination, using highly trained forensic archaeologists and pathologists.
The murder squad spent the next 5 days digging in Belinda's field, but the bodies they had expected to find were nowhere to be seen. In April 2003, police had been searching for the Chohan family for over 2 months, but they'd been looking in the wrong place.
We planned to go out for an evening's canoeing. Nice quiet day, nice calm sea, pleasantly warm at the time of year. Yeah, so it was an enjoyable evening that we decided to venture out further than what we normally would do. After a short while, I noticed something floating in the sea. It appeared to be 3 floating objects, which at a distance was unusual.
You know, as we were sort of just canoeing around looking about, I had noticed something, but I just totally discarded it. It wasn't until he sort of shouted body at me, I was just like, what?
As I approached them, I realised that it was obviously a body. A large body because it was oversized, somewhat inflated, but the feet were floating out of the water, and the torso. The head was face downwards in the water.
He got me to go in, call up 999.
I was determined to stay with the body, come what may. But I did expect the rescue service would have been there sooner rather than later. When you've been in the water canoeing in the dark for nearly 3 hours, it does get a bit unnerving. You can't ignore a body. Once you find a body, it's there. I guess I think I can still see that body floating.
The body was taken to a mortuary in Bournemouth, but it would be almost a week before it was identified as that of missing businessman Anil Chohan.
I went to Bournemouth and saw the body. The first time I had a look on Anil's face, I could see that he suffered a tragic death. He suffered a violent death.
He had received a blunt trauma injury to the back of his head. He had had packing tape wound round his mouth. But the main blow to the head, followed by a subsequent suffocation, is the likely cause of death for Mr. Chohan.
While Anil Chohan's clothes were removed for forensic analysis, 100 miles away, police were still searching for evidence that his body had been buried in Belinda Bruin's field.
The site of the dig obviously became extremely important, and we recovered some substantial evidence from that dig site, namely hairs from their burnt clothing, jewellery, which suggested that it had in fact been a burial site. Those hairs were subsequently identified as Mr. Chohan's. He had been murdered. At some stage he had been placed in the grave down in Devon, that he had been exhumed from that grave at a later date, put into a boat. The boat had gone out into the middle of the bay at Bournemouth and dumped it into the sea.
Until his body was found, we all hoped that he would be back one day. Even if he had sold the company or not, he would still be back one day just to visit us or whatever. But when his body was found, you had just lost all hope, and that was it. It was the end of him.
But then our concerns we knew what had happened to Anil, but then our concerns drifted towards Nancy and the kids and the mother.
The fact that the dig site was so big, and that if you had wanted just to hide one body, you wouldn't needed to have gone to the extent of digging such a huge site, coupled with the fact the entire family had gone missing, coupled with the fact there had been a bonfire there, and that we had recovered some items of jewellery which we believed to belong to Nancy, and also there was some small poppers found, the type that one would find on baby grow suits. So we believed that the family had all been put into the ground at that point. From that moment on, the entire investigation changed focus and became a Category A, which is the highest category of murder inquiry. Kenneth Regan, obviously from that point on, became prime suspect. At that stage, Regan's whereabouts were unknown, as were Hauncy's. They were very much on the loose, so to speak.
I was a bit overcome by the whole thing, really, and I don't really know what I thought, but it never maybe I just didn't want to think that somebody had been buried in my field. So I tried to make myself busy, and I noticed that my horse had ripped its horse blanket. So I took it off the horse, put it in the car, and I drove up the lane. And lo and behold, I bumped into Regan and Hornsey, who were in a car. I was really shocked to see them. And Regan wound the window down. And I said to him, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "We need to have a little chat." And Hornsey then said, "Why didn't you get in the car? We'll go and have a coffee." And I thought, well, I don't want to get in the car with them. So I had the horse blanket next to me, and there was a little cottage just up. And I said, I've got to take this back. I've borrowed this from, you know, pointing to that. I've got to take it back to them. They were expecting it back. I'll be back in 2 minutes, I said. So they said, okay. So I drove off, and I drove round the corner, and I phoned DI round, and he said, "Whatever you do, don't get in the car with them." So I said, okay. He said, "I'm going to send 2 police officers back." 2 police officers arrived, but Regan and Hornsey had gone.
Regan and Hornsey had escaped to Europe, leaving Peter Rees behind. But alone and on the run, Rees developed a guilty conscience.
I think he was cornered. He didn't know me from Adam. He just came in, sat down and more or less started pouring his heart out.
At the time, Wendy Powles was staying at a boarding house when a new lodger moved in. Within hours, Rees made a startling confession.
I just took him as any, you know, new lodger that came there. Until he started saying, "Have I seen him on TV?" And I said, "No, should I have done?" And so I just wondered, he said, "Because I have been on TV," and I thought, oh, he's not a celebrity or anything, you know, he didn't look that way. And he just said that he was involved with an Asian family that had disappeared. They could put me at the scene of where the bodies were buried, but I didn't kill anybody. He was going, you know, they can't do that, they can't pin that on me. And I had to say to him, you know, what is going on, you know. He just said that Regan was crazy because he killed 2 children. I gasped, and I said, how were they killed? He said that Regan had shot them. It was Regan, he's a psycho, he said. He killed them all. I knew what I had to do, because how many people come to your home every day and say they've killed 5 people and 2 babies? Well, 3 adults and 2 babies.
Wendy Powles alerted the police, and after just 12 days on the run, Peter Rees was arrested at a nearby pub. Despite his confession to Wendy Powles, Rees refused to answer any questions, and the whereabouts of the Chohan family remained a mystery. But 3 weeks later, a fisherman discovered another body floating in the Solent.
I was told that Nancy's body was decomposed, but I insisted on seeing the body, because for me it was not a skeleton. For me it was my baby sister. For me she was still alive, and I was talking to her. And that was it. A tearful goodbye, that's what I said. I felt sorry that I couldn't save her. I did say that, "Nancy, I tried my best, but I couldn't save you."
Kenneth Regan was tracked down by police in Belgium after 2 months on the run. And just 6 weeks later, William Hornsey gave himself up. The 3 prime suspects were now in custody, but they refused to answer any questions. With 3 family members still missing and no witnesses to the murders, police needed hard evidence to link their suspects to the crime. Little did they realize that the vital clue they needed had been left by Anil Chohan himself. April 2005 saw the start of the longest criminal trial in the history of the Old Bailey. Police were trying to prove that Kenneth Regan, William Hornsey and Peter Rees had abducted and murdered all 5 members of the Chohan family. The 9-month trial saw almost 4,500 different exhibits, from financial transactions to petrol receipts. But it was telephone tracking evidence which provided the foundation for the whole case.
We got ourselves into a position where we pretty much knew exactly what had gone on and could give a very clear indication to the trial, the enormity of the crime and who'd committed it.
Initially, police had established Regan and Chohan's movements by tracking their mobiles. Once they gained access to Hornsey and Rees's phones, they had compelling evidence for an abduction.
Our telephone intelligence had suggested that Mr. Chohan had been with Mr. Regan, Hornsey and Rees. And then the telephones travelled down to Wilton in Salisbury, namely 3 Forge Close, which was Ken Regan's home address, over the critical period when Mr. Chohan had initially had gone missing. There was never a time that one of those telephones wasn't in that area, leading us to believe he was being guarded at number 3 Forge Close.
All the men could now be placed at the scene, but detectives still needed further clues as to what really happened at 3 Forge Close. In the run-up to the trial, they unexpectedly received some vital new evidence from one of the suspect's own relatives.
Mr. Hornsey's son approached police and produced to us a Lexmark colour printer and also this grey suitcase which contained a number of pieces of A4 paper with Mr. Chohan's signature on.
The printer and documents from Hornsey's suitcase explained how Regan had managed to convince the staff at SEBA that Neil Chohan had sold the company and left the country.
Now listen.
Police argued that Neil Chohan was held at 3 Forge Close so Regan could force him to sign the documents under duress.
What are you playing at? What are you doing? Just fucking sign it.
The suitcase contained 10 blank sheets with Chohan's signature, spares which Regan could have used to produce other forgeries if they were needed.
Regan's initial plan was to get rid of Anil Chohan. I think once he'd gone down that road, he was left in a position where he had to murder the entire family, because he knew that had he not done so, that Nancy would have raised the alarm. We could see clearly from the telephone intelligence that while Mr. Rees remained in Salisbury, Regan and Hornsey travelled to London, to Sutton Road, Hounslow, where they spent several hours. I can only guess, but it's possible that that is when the family met their deaths in that address. I don't know that to date. What I can say is that Regan and Hornsey were in that area, and I can say that the family disappeared on that day. For Mr. Regan, these murders were something he had to do to get what he wanted, and it meant little to him as changing his shirt.
The police were unable to establish precisely where or when the family were murdered, but they were convinced that Neil Chohan had been killed at Regan's bungalow. The problem was proving it.
We carried out a full forensic examination of the premises over many days. There was nothing significantly found there. The reasons for this was that the room had been recently decorated, and certainly the furniture from that room was certainly removed, and Mr. Regan had replaced it immediately with new furniture.
The fact that the premises had been redecorated, the carpet had been removed, the sofa had been removed, really was clearly indicative of someone trying to conceal evidence and clean up a crime scene.
But despite the suspicious activity at the house, it was not proof that Chohan had been murdered by Regan. It was only a single extraordinary piece of evidence that would convince the jury beyond reasonable doubt. A clue which had been initially overlooked by the scientists and left in storage for almost 8 months. A clue left by Anil Chohan himself.
We have 2 exhibits here. One is the right sock of Mr. Chohan, which was taken from him at the post-mortem down in Dorset. Most of the clothes were submitted immediately to the Forensic Science Service for examination, but socks, normally there's very little evidential value in socks, but for completeness we decided to send the remaining items of clothing to the scientists who had requested them. When the scientists unpackaged the sock and examined it, inside was found a folded piece of paper. As you can see, it's in a very delicate state. It has been dried, but it's obviously been in the seawater. I think the way it's been folded so many times has protected it. It's a letter from the Cheltenham and Gloucester Building Society, and it's addressed to Mr. Regan of number 3 Forge Close, and it's dated the 12th of February 2003, which clearly meant it arrived the day we believe Mr. Chohan was being held captive at Forge Close. You can only imagine the fear that Mr. Chohan would have been in to secret this in his person, and certainly to put it into his sock. He must have realised that he faced imminent death.
Of course, it's overwhelming evidence of the message that Mr. Chohan was trying to send from beyond the grave as to who had actually murdered him.
After a 9-month trial, the jury reached a unanimous verdict. Peter Rees was sentenced to 23 years for the murder of Anil Chohan. Hornsey and Regan each received 5 consecutive life sentences for murdering the Chohan family. They will never be released from prison. The remains of Charanjit Kaur, Anil Chohan's mother-in-law, were eventually found off the coast of the Isle of Wight. But the bodies of the 2 babies, 18-month-old Devinder and 8-week-old Ravinder, have never been found.
I think that the killing of any child is extremely tragic. And I think as a police officer, having investigated such crimes, you can normally see a reason why that happened. Someone snapped, someone was depressed, someone was mentally ill, and there's normally a variety of motivations for a child being murdered. In these circumstances, the motivation was purely self-gain and greed, and for me, I found that particularly horrific.
I still have nightmares about how the killers might have killed Nancy, or who was killed first. Was Nancy killed in front of my mom? Or my mom killed in front of Nancy? or the kid killed in front of Mom and Nancy. And it's just very hard, you know. And I don't think I'll ever be able to come to terms with it.
Onka returned to New Zealand. He would never meet his sister's children. The only time he saw them all together was on a family video he found in their empty home.
When I found Nancy's video was filmed just 2 days before the disappearance.
Hello? Nina, 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 Nina.
And I could see in the video the family celebrating life and the kids playing in the house. The eldest son, he took his first steps in the video, and my mom, she was very happy in the video. When I had a look at the video, I was very happy, you know, because I never actually saw Anil and Nancy living together.
Do it properly, gardener. Very nice.
But through that video, I came to know that Nancy was very happy with Anil, and she was, you know, she was very lucky to have a guy like Anil with her. Every time I close my eyes, I can see Nancy smiling, and as if nothing has happened, she's still there and she's waiting for me to come over.